Good afternoon, welcome back if you've joined us in our previous session, and if you're here for the first time, on behalf of the Elsevier South Africa team, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you to this year's Library Connect. And I apologize if you've heard me say this welcome message a few times in the past day, but just for the newcomers. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Daneshri Modli, I'm the customer consultant for Elsevier. And joining me from the Elsevier team is John Sturley, who is the account manager for Elsevier South Africa, Lucia Scumbi, who is a senior customer consultant for research intelligence, as well as today's presenter, Dion Lubber, solution sales manager for research intelligence, and our customer marketer for Africa, Mohammed Sayed. Just a few notes before we begin. Please use the Q&A box should you have any questions throughout the session. Q&A is going to be addressed in the last 15 minutes of the session, and we'll endeavor to answer as many questions as we can. Okay, we'll be having one more session today, and you'll have a 15-minute break after the session before the next one begins. So the recordings of today's presentation, as well as the presentation slides, they will be available on the platform which you use to register for this year's Library Connect. This is a virtual experience platform, so I encourage you to go to the platform and use all of the options on the site, especially the exhibitions option, where you can visit the different exhibition stands to get more information about the Elsevier product portfolio. And to view the speaker on the right-hand side with the presentation on the left on your Zoom screen, I will encourage you to use the view button, which is at the top right corner of your screen, and select the option side-by-side speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Lucia Scumbi. She's a senior customer consultant working with the research intelligence portfolio for Elsevier. In her current role, she works with academic institutions across the African continent on matters relating to research evaluation, as well as journal quality, publishing strategy, and university ranking applying. She's applying Elsevier research intelligence tools, and she is based in Stellenbosch, South Africa. So welcome, Lucia.
Okay, so the topic of this presentation is differentiating between predatory and low quality journals. And I know I'm talking to an audience that knows a lot about this topic, so I want to focus a little bit today on Scopus and what Scopus is doing. And then also I hope I'm going to have time. We've lost some time now, but I hope we're going to have time at the end, because I'd really love you to also share with me some of your experiences, because you being librarians, I'm sure you're also doing this kind of training, and you have, inquiries from researchers and what you've learned and what is best practice on your side. So if you could share that, that would be really great. So why are we talking about this issue today? Well, first thing that came up in my mind was that it's also a pandemic. We're definitely seeing a tremendous increase in predatory journals. The slide that you're seeing now, the graph, especially, it's a little bit old, but I think it's so pertinent in showing what the growth has been over the past few years. So this was between 2010 and 2014. And you can see on the red line, there was really an escalation from about 2011, 2012. And then recently, there's also been some more research done into this to also show what is the damage of this in terms of monetary value. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. At the moment, we're seeing, if you recall, and all of you know Beale's list, Beale listed about 1,400 predatory journals. We're now talking about more or less 34,000 predatory journals. I haven't put that on the slide because I read that somewhere, but I can't recall what the reference was. But I distinctly, made a note that this is, such a high number of predatory journals. So a huge issue that we are contending with. But we should start actually just like, what is predatory publishing? Because this is also actually quite a problem. Going back in history, we know that it was coined by Jeffrey Beall, librarian at the University of Colorado. It dates back to 2010 when he started noticing emails being sent to researchers asking for their manuscripts, and he started a blog, and he became the unofficial watchdog, basically, then for predatory publishing. Then abruptly, he stopped his website around, it was on the 17th of September 2017. Nobody really knows why exactly, but the speculation was basically that he was forced to do so by his university because they feared legal action from predatory publishers. So Beall's definition was that predatory journals prey on unsuspecting and often young scholars to submit their manuscripts for the sole purpose of making money from these scholars. So this was what I also noticed, that they were soliciting manuscripts, but they weren't doing any peer review, or there was very superficial peer review. They didn't do any work to the manuscript. They were able to then accept large numbers of manuscripts within a very short turnaround time. And this is then where they were able to make money, being able to then publish on a very short turnaround time. So Beall's point was then really that predatory journals and publishers are in the business of defrauding scientists and scholars. So the Beall's list has been, he closed down his list. It is archived, so it is available, and there are anonymous persons who are upkeeping it, so it is still available to be accessed. So that's basically the history. But unfortunately, Beall was often criticized for being opposed to open access. So since 2010, a lot of research has been done to determine the merit of Beall's criteria and also to come up with a universally accepted definition. So some researchers said that predatory was too narrow a term because it doesn't capture the fact that there are scholars that are engaging with predatory publishing willingly. And then also it was saying that, you know, it was too broad also sometimes because the spamming and things like that, it was done, that doesn't necessarily, all of those things that are related to, or that doesn't always add up to a journal being predatory. So one of the new definitions that have come up is, one was by Maton, who did a study, he and Astrid Valentine, they did a study, and they said that where you can definitely, one of the things that stand out, and it's can be regarded as a definition, is when the journal has the intention to deceive and defraud. When that is very evident, that will count as a definition. And then in the end of 2019, there was a study, a group of researchers that study this phenomenon of predatory journals. They came together at the end of 2019, and they published their results in Nature. And their definition was that predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best practice and publication practices, lack of transparency, and or the use of aggressive, indiscriminate practices like email sending. So there's been a lot of work now to try to consolidate what exactly are we talking about when we are talking about predatory publishing. So these are the authors of the paper in Nature. It's well worth, because this is a summary of what they regarded are the characteristics and the definition, but of course there's a lot more in the paper itself. So just a summary then of what can be regarded as red flags, and I'll come back to that, because these red flags do not necessarily, when each one of them would not constitute being predatory. But there are definitely red flags that you should be looking out for. So things like fake impact factors, incorrect addresses, misrepresentation of editorial board, false claim of indexing of membership and of membership of associations, misleading claims of peer review. So that's one. Then deviation from best editorial practices. So unprofessional looking website. Obviously that's not necessarily predatory, but it should be a red flag if you see spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, irrelevant text. It could mean that it has been machine translated and things like that. Lack of transparency is another thing. So little or no information about the editorial decisions, how it's made, what the fees are that apply, how the peer review is organized, absent contact information, no details about the APCs, editorial editors and members of the editorial boards are not verifiable. So there's that lack of transparency then. And then there's the emails that we are very well familiar with. So there would also be then a clear indication there would be if the recipient of the email, if there's no relation with the journal title, so it's not, so it's really outside of scope with what the journal title says. So that's a clear red flag. But then we really need to look, and this is where there's a lot of confusion that is taking place, is what is really predatory, so it's deceptive, it's fraudulent, and what is just sloppy or poor journals. When you're looking at deceptive, this is non-cumulative, so it doesn't add up. So any one of these aspects can indicate that it is a predatory journal, where if you look at sloppy, then it is more cumulative. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So on this deceptive side, so this is predatory, false information about performing peer review, for one. So if it says that it's doing peer review and it's not doing peer review, so false information about the editorial board, false information about the location, about impact factor, about indexing services that are provided, whether they are, false information about the cost. So often there's no information about the cost, and then suddenly there's an invoice, or the amounts are not the same. On the sloppy side, I'm just calling it sloppy, but on the poor journal side, you would have papers in the journal that would indicate that it is of poor quality, or it would not seem academic at all. And this could happen with an inexperienced editorial board, for example. So a department within a university would start up a journal, for instance, they don't have a lot of experience yet, they would accept some poor papers. That does not mean it's a predatory journal, it just means that it is low quality. And that they could still, there's a room that they might improve as well. When the scope of interest is too broad on the website, this is usually explained, but if it's very broad, that would indicate usually that it's a poor journal, because most journals, unless it's multidisciplinary, but they define the scope of the journal very narrowly usually. When they accept papers that are out of scope, so usually this is a sign of desperation. It might be a new journal, inexperienced, and so on, so they accept any papers. When the website also lacks important information, like submission requirements, what the processes are, and so on, this also indicates poor. If the journal is not indexed, so this is a tricky one, because a journal could also not be indexed because it's a very young journal, but if it's a journal that has been around for a long time and it's not indexed by one of the international indexes or even a local index, it probably means that it's not meeting the criteria of the index, and that should be a question mark. Also, if there's no strategy for handling misconduct, that's usually also mentioned on the website. If it's absent, it could be a problem. And also, if there's no strategy, explain if there's no indication of what is the digital preservation of this journal. So you have no indication of, are they just putting it on a website? Do they have any, any archiving policies and so on, right? So the two sides, you can clearly see when it's deceptive, when there's false information, fake information, definitely predatory, but then be careful not to put poor journals into that grouping as well. So it's important also to reflect why this is happening, and we often get this question about, what has led to this, and there are a few reasons that you can think of. So first is the publish and perish situation, because academics rely on publication for their career progression. They're really desperate to publish, so they can easily become victims in terms of sending manuscripts to whoever offers to publish. There's technology, of course, because it's very easy to set up a website. It's easy to spam. It's easy to scrape emails from the internet. It's easy to receive electronic payments. So this whole environment, the whole technology environment makes it conducive to be able to do this kind of activity. You also get inexperience. I'm referring here to researchers working in a remote location often, so working from home, not visiting the library, where you have access to experts who are able to help you differentiate between what is a good journal and what is not a good journal. So also not being in close contact sometimes with the supervisor. So this online environment where people are working remotely or alone and not access to supporting information in this sense. And then obviously there's the very clear exploitation of the open access model, which is being so absolutely, the fact that researchers are paying to publish is being misused by these predatory journals, right? So this is quite a nice quote that was also, if I remember right now, it was also the grouping that came up with the definition. And the part that I wanted to highlight here is that, it's just to make it very clear that that when we're talking about open access, when we're talking about open access publishing, is that there should not be an assumption that all open access journals are problematic, because this has really scared some researchers into avoiding open access journals, and this is definitely not a message that we want to put out there. So if we're talking about what is the impact about that, and why researchers should be so careful in terms of falling prey, is because it has monetary implications for the institution. It's university time and resources that are used when research is being done. It does cause reputational costs as well. It can influence employability. So there's most funding organizations, when researchers are applying for grants and promotion and prizes and things like that, the lists of publications are definitely checked more rigorously now. Research time and funding has been wasted. It also has a negative impact on ranking and research assessment, of course, because these can also be included in that. And then most of all, it compromises the science system. So this is actually the quote that I was thinking of, where it very clearly says that, that this is a phenomenon that has the potential to seriously affect the scientific community and also to pollute the societal and political landscape, undermining progress and public trust in science. And I think specifically now with the pandemic, this is the last thing that we want, is we do not want to undermine, the trust in science. So this is, I think, a very strong message why this is such a dangerous phenomenon. So I just wanted to share a few examples of, of what it practically looks like. I think most, let me just go back. So, I had a slide about what that email looks like, but it seems like I've removed it from the slide deck. Most of us have seen it, but to look out for if it's anonymous. So it would be from the editor-in-chief, but it wouldn't necessarily mention a name. That's not good. And then also it would have either very flattering tone. You would be just a master's student, but you're being invited as a distinguished researcher to submit your manuscript, that kind of language. Be careful of that. But this is an example of a real predatory journal. Unfortunately, we have to close the name. But here you can see that it shows deviation from best practice here in terms of the branding of this journal. It's using images from the internet, so very clearly not very professional. When you see those little garbage letters, that usually indicates that the text has been copy pasted, so look out for that. This is another name where you can see that there's not a lot of transparency, no personal names are mentioned, there's no location. So even this is a page about contact information, there's no location. The name is an acronym of the publisher, so it's difficult to ascertain whether it's real and where it's coming from. So these kinds of, where there are no personal names, no geographic locations, to be careful and watch out for that. Deviation also here in terms of sloppy grammar, vague information, just talking about some non-governmental affiliations where usually a journal would be very clear about who they are affiliated with. Right, so this is another example where here also you can see that the branding that is being used, this is just a random library photo that was taken from the internet. It's also referring to some metrics. So you can see the impact factor there, but this is a false impact factor. Also referring to ICV, which is a metric used by Index Copernicus. So Index Copernicus, there's a lot of debate about, how legitimate are they? It's really difficult to say, but they are definitely associated with a lot of predatory activity. So just take note of that. In this example here, one of the red flags that I mentioned is to look at the scope of articles that are accepted by the journal. So here you can see that there's the scope is very wide. So from research papers right up to an MTech or a PhD thesis, the really unrealistic scope of materials accepted. Once again, you can see that there aren't names mentioned, so very vague information about contact. And here you can see that they're trying to confuse or mislead researchers by, making up, names of metrics. Like, so site factor is trying to confuse in terms of site score, which is used by Scopus, and then the journal impact factor is often as an acronym JIF. So, and here they're talking about JIF factor. So really, trying to confuse and mislead authors. This is another example where the editorial team, these are real researchers, but they have no idea that they've been added to this page, or to add to this editorial team. So for the researchers to be, to recommend that when they look at the editorial board, they should be able to recognize the editorial board members as experts in their field, at least one. So if there's no recognition of anybody on the editorial team and there's no way to really validate who they are, it should warrant some further investigation. So I just want to emphasize here that I'm I'm mentioning these red flags, but they do not in itself always constitute a predatory journal. These are just some of the characteristics that you can look out for. So addressing the problem, if you go to COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, what they suggest is how to address this issue. On the one hand, is to really focus on education around this. So encourage research. A lot of research is being done on this phenomenon and trying to distinguish it from other kinds of deviant behaviors of journals. So a lot of research is already being done, and to encourage that, also to raise awareness through library programs, through the kind of session that we're having today, and to provide some guidance for authors. The other one is to criminalize it. So this is more difficult, but I want to mention at least one example that we already know about, because this would really be the ultimate way of handling it, even though it's not so easy. So the one example that we know of is of a researcher. It was actually a PhD student who submitted his manuscript to a journal, the Journal of Forensic Research. It sounds very legitimate. So he submitted, and then he received an email from a titleist. He says that there was no designation, who said he should fix some of the typographical errors, and if he fails to send the corrections within 48 hours, they will assume that he's agreed to publish it. So threatening language there. And then also an invoice then with a astronomical fee to publish this article. So he made the corrections, all typographical. He made all the corrections, sent it to the publisher, and then he noticed within 2 days, or I think it was 24 hours, it was published, but without the corrections. And then he knew something serious was up, and he decided then to take legal action. So he was assisted by the US Federal Trade Commission. They took it up. They had a court case against Omex Group, and they won the case last year, and Omex was fined $50.1 million US. Right. So this is a good example of what should actually happen if we all had that kind of resources. Okay. So what to do about this, and how can we advise authors about what to do? Now, there are basically 3 strategies out there at the moment. The one is to use avoid lists, things like Beall's list. There's the Scopus discontinued list. There's the directory of open access delisted journals. There's Jajalian's list. There's Cabell's International. There's a list called Stop Predatory Journals, etc. So all of these lists go to a tremendous amount of effort actually to identify these predatory journals, investigate them, find evidence, and list them. But the research that I referred to earlier that was done by the group that published in Nature. They found more than 90 such lists, and they compared them, and they found that there was no consistency in terms of what they actually had within these lists. And it's also very difficult then to recommend authors to go to these lists, because there's not one authoritative list to use yet. So this is the one strategy, and this is better than doing nothing, is to use the checklists. Another option is to use the trusted list. So any lists that go through a curation process, like Scopus, like Web of Science, like the Directory of Open Access Journals, they go to a lot of effort to apply selection criteria. So this is also an option. And then there's think, check, and submit. So they have the philosophy that we should really train authors to take the correct steps in identifying journals, right? So this is not about making sure it's not a predatory journal. This is good practice in how do you select a journal, and their school of thought is that if you follow these guidelines, you will automatically disqualify a predatory journal. So things like when you have your manuscript, to use the aims and scope of the journal and make sure that it's a right fit for your work, that it matches the scope of the journal, that it accepts that type of article, that it has the right readership. So if you follow that good practice in terms of this is the steps that we need to follow in terms of identifying journals, like I said, you will automatically not submit to a predatory journal, right? So next, I just want to focus a little bit on what Scopus is doing. We get a lot of queries because Scopus is one of the accredited lists. We are super vigilant in terms of making or trying to make sure that we do not get predatory journals in Scopus. It's getting more and more difficult as the predatory journals become more aggressive. We've even had cases where they have tried to what is the word, where they've tried to pay some of the members of the content selection and advisory board to accept their journals. Right, so all journals, all 24,000 journals have gone through the selection process. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think most of you know about what the criteria are. There's 6 basic criteria and then 14 more other criteria, which goes deeply into the policy, the peer review system that is used, the standing of the journal, who's the editorial board, is it consistent in publishing, what does the website look for? So it's really scrutinized in that way. And then it also complies with, when we look at what is the responsibility of what Scopus can do and what Scopus cannot do, is that to keep in mind that Scopus can only look at what is the, on the journal level. Okay, so we look specifically, the Content and Selection Advisory Board look at what is the level of the quality on the journal level, and to also monitor and deselect titles that are predatory and below standard. And this is what they are no or very limited influence, and we get some queries about this, and this is why I wanted to mention Scopus does not have an influence or a responsibility in terms of editorial decisions. So sometimes get a query about a specific article which was clearly plagiarized or anything like that. That is not Scopus's role to take action there. What we would do is to flag it and to flag it to the journal, but that would not constitute removing the journal, for example. So anything related to the article level or the scientific content, where the plagiarism has taken place, the authorship of the paper, those kinds of where misconduct happens on that level, all we can do is to refer it to the journal itself, but that would not constitute removing it from Scopus. So the view that we have within Scopus is what we do with poor quality journals. So, and we have a responsibility within Scopus to make sure that the journals that we have in Scopus are representative. So the idea of Scopus is not to be an elite list of journals. So we need to provide a range in quality for all authors to be able to select a journal that is relevant for their own level of research. So you would find that not all the journals within Scopus are on an elite level. So we have that responsibility to make sure that it is representative. It could also be that when an article is published, or the journal could appear to be a poor journal, but you could still have high quality articles within that journal. Right? So in this sense, there will be poor journals within Scopus, and this is just to make provision for that range that is necessary for Scopus to be representative. If it's predatory, it has no place in Scopus, and there will definitely be steps to remove it immediately, because that is really regarded as a threat to science. So what the steps are that are being taken is that it is ongoing in terms of looking at the selection criteria. So the curation takes place on an ongoing basis. Oh gosh, I look like I'm running out of time. Also to develop new approaches. So continuously updating how we can automatically identify journals that are problematic, identifying a process for continuous monitoring. Excluding a journal from Scopus is complex. So given the risk of discontinuing legitimate journals. So this has also happened, and we've also had cases where fake news has been spread about a legitimate journal. It was removed, and then it had to be reinstated. So there's a lot of care that is taken now to make sure that we have evidence, and I'll come back to that when a journal is removed. Okay. So the evidence and the specific concerns are important to make sure that we can handle issues within Scopus very quickly. So evidence is required about the integrity and the quality. So it's difficult for our content selection and advisory board to just act on hearsay or on a very broad comment that this journal does not or seems predatory. It's best to be able to to have the evidence and to also identify specific concerns, because the contents and selection advisory board, these are editors that are working in their own environments to make it more conducive for them and easy for them to follow up on these predatory journals. We need to say this and this are specifically what the problems are, so that they can look into those. Right? So when you do report it, when we do rely a lot on librarians and researchers reporting journals that look like they might be predatory, that we can follow up on, if you can, as much information around that as possible. So the process that we have at the moment within Scopus, it's basically on 4 levels. It's using metrics, using an algorithm within Scopus to check what is the quality of the citations and so on. How much it's downloaded, so that we can measure that. There's also a radar. It's also an algorithm that we call radar. It looks at the outlier performance. So if we see that there's an increase in a specific authorship, so if it goes from a purely South African based authorship to suddenly a large number of any other nation, that would indicate something is not right. Or a sudden increase in the number of publications. So this algorithm picks up that, and it flags it for reevaluation. And then direct feedback is very, very useful. And this is actually the biggest category that we're using. Also, when we are evaluating journals, so we do need to have, as I mentioned, a representative body of journals within Scopus. So sometimes a journal, which is a new journal, new editorial board, so they do get into Scopus, but if the content selection and advisory board are a little bit concerned about the quality of the journal, they would flag it for automatic reevaluation. So that's the 4th way that we look at it. Then it's flagged, goes back to the content selection and advisory board, and it's reevaluated. I'm going to skip this, and I want to show you then what the numbers look like. Right? So using those different methods, you can see that the publication concerns are the highest. So these are the ones that are also then, reported to us. Underperformance is when there's a lot of self-citations within the journal, that's also then picked up. That's the second highest group. Outlier performance, the number of publications increase or the authorship changes. Third, and then the continuous reevaluation. That's then the fourth grouping. So since 2016, we've discontinued 482 titles using these methods. Just to mention a few of the policy updates, because I think this is also important in terms of Scopus trying to improve from our side also the usability of Scopus in this aspect. So the timing of stopping the content feed within discontinued journals. So it takes about, let me see if I've got that. No, it's not here, but it takes about 3 months for the whole investigation into a journal. And while that investigation is going on, then the articles are still coming into Scopus. So this has been a problem. So the new policy, which will be implemented possibly in the beginning of next year, is that the content flow will be put on hold when the journal is flagged for reevaluation. So we'll immediately stop new articles coming in because they can be cited and so on. Then the announcement of the discontinuation, there was a discrepancy because we have the Scopus.com where you have the source browse list. It was updated and the discontinued sources list was published on another date. So trying to synchronize those so that there's also no discrepancy. And this is very important for researchers who want to apply for subsidy for their publications, because sometimes the journal is still has been discontinued in the source browse list in Scopus.com, but it's not yet in the discontinued sources list. So trying to close that gap. And then finally also discontinued journals and the inclusion of metrics was also a problem. So going forward from 2021, if metrics will not be taken into account, metrics coming from predatory or discontinued journals will not be taken into account for any kind of evaluation. So it will not be used in H-index or in the citations and the information that's provided to
I think we've lost Lucia for a second, so if you wouldn't mind, there she is.
Oh, am I back?
Yes.
I'm going to wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay.
So just talking about what researchers can do when they have accidentally published in a predatory journal is to immediately request withdrawal if they've not already paid the APC. Threaten with legal action, that has been quite successful in some cases. And then in certain cases, it is possible, because often these predatory publishers will not even respond to your emails, but you can contact an editor-in-chief of a legitimate journal, discuss the problem, and in some cases they have published the article with a note to say this is the only valid version of the paper. So everything is not completely lost, but still the best is to avoid. And then I just wanted to I've already mentioned think, check, submit. This is very valuable, and I think where librarians play a very big role is to really support researchers in how to select journals using the proper, basically, questions, leading questions, to make sure that they are selecting the right journal for their specific research, and then by default avoiding to select a predatory journal. So with that, the end, I'm sorry I went a little bit over time. Maybe it's because I started late, had a hiccup there. I'm including my references, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thanks so much, Lucia, for that presentation. We haven't received anything in Q&A, but I think let's give our participants a minute if they'd like to submit anything. And in the interim, I just would like to ask you a question. Sure. Is predatory publishing a problem in book publishing?
Yes, that's a good question, because it does occur, but it is just a lot less prominent. Yes. So the most of the cases that we have are with journals, but it does certainly also occur within the book publishing community as well. And I'm not aware of a list that really focuses on books, identifying them, but yes, it is something that we should be looking out for.
And how does it impact conference publishing?
Conference publishing is also becoming a very big problem. So fake conference, not fake, well, predatory conferences as well, because they don't apply any kind of peer review, they accept any papers, and of course then they make a lot of money from the conference registration fees. So this, in Scopus, this is handled in the same way as journals. So conference proceedings also have to go through the rigorous selection process that journals go through. But as yet, I'm not aware, and maybe somebody in the audience is and can share that with us, but I'm not aware of a list of conferences, of predatory conferences, but I would love to know if that exists. To share it with us.
Thanks, Lucia. We haven't received any further questions in Q&A, so since we are, as always, really well delivered. And 15, and you can either exit and rejoin on the link that you have, or you can stay logged on for our next speaker. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.